Welcome to episode 152, Being Human and a Therapist, Awareness of Burnout, Roles, Power, and Therapeutic Love, featuring Julia Aziz, licensed clinical social worker. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and today I am delighted and honored to be joined by Julia Aziz. She is a licensed clinical social worker, and she has spent a good portion of her career working with helping professionals and understanding how to be a human and a therapist at the same time, and how to balance the reality that we're real people outside of the room who have real things happen. I mean, before we started recording, Julia and I had a conversation about brain fog, so like things like that come into the room, and how we navigate being a helping professional while dealing with our own lives and thoughts and worlds outside of the therapy room. Thank you so much for joining us, Julia. I'm delighted to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Beth.
So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about you and how you came to have this specialization in understanding therapist burnout and the reality of what it means to be a helping professional in today's world?
Sure. So much of the work I do now, like you mentioned, is supporting other therapists. I'm a holistic psychotherapist, and most of my clients are helping professionals themselves, or their moms, or mostly they're women who spend a lot of their time and energy tending to the needs of other people. So I started out in the mental health field about 25-ish years ago. And I do work independently now, but for that first decade or so, I was in all sorts of different settings. I've worked in hospice, sexual assault, domestic violence, alternative schools, psychiatric care, as well as counseling with individual adults, couples, families, teens, children, you name it. So through all of those experiences, I went through my own burnout, and I also witnessed many colleagues doing the same as well. So in 2004, I led my first retreat for helping professionals with meditation, writing, movement. And I, since then, have been developing a body of work to support those on the front lines of caring for others. So currently, as a holistic psychotherapist, I do still have some individual clients, and I also am a big proponent of what I call self-healing in community. So I run a program called the Release and Empower Women's Circle, which is all about gathering the helpers together to express and care for themselves, and using mind-body practice, witnessing in community. It's powerful work, and I love what I do, and it's really an honor to be holding space for people who are holding so much themselves.
Today's conversation is really kind of, as you and I talked about it, what we're calling the integrity challenge of being a person and being a therapist. We are recording this right now in May of 2022, so we are solidly 2+ years into a pandemic. So much burnout and unending. I don't know any therapists right now who don't have a full or over full caseload, because the demand is just extraordinary. There's so much suffering, an increase in overdoses, increase in mental health disorders. And we as healers, helpers, feel called to try to meet that need, but then we're suffering ourselves. Can you speak for a little bit just about why this particular topic was important to you and how we spend our time together today?
Yeah, I mean, it's important because if we're not well ourselves, how are we going to be any kind of companion in wellness to somebody else? You know, I think about, I don't know if you ever watched, what's it called? A Million Little Things.
Mm.
There's a show, and they deal with some really important mental health issues. And oftentimes at the end, they'll say, for support, call this hotline or reach out to your mental health professional. Or, we see that tagged on to the bottom of articles about the pandemic and all sorts of things. And so that's great. And what about those mental health professionals? They're people too. And so if we have this system where we're relying on certain people to have compassion and presence and intervene in a crisis and be able to hold faith in many ways, that it's possible, we have to feel that ourselves. So I guess I see it as there has to be a backup. There has to be a place where the helping professionals can go and be themselves and be humans and be vulnerable so that they can regain their strength. They can regain that sense of, okay, this is a hard time, but it's a worthwhile journey. Mm-hmm. And, I want to be here. And I want to show up, as opposed to feeling sort of the burden of having to.
I appreciate the word that you just used in this idea of feeling the burden of having to. And what I've seen in the field is this kind of struggle with accepting where we're at. And I'm speaking in generalizations, absolutely, but looking at the field, where for many of us, we haven't been on the front lines, for those folks who have been in hospitals, who've been excluded from that generalization. But for most of us, we were able to go online. We were able to be in relative physical safety, but then we're putting ourselves very much at the emotional front lines, if you will. For me, I came to almost appreciate it as like this, kind of shepherd in the storm, that we had this flock of clients that we were serving and tending to, caring for. But what does the shepherd do in the storm? How does the shepherd stay warm? How does the shepherd cope with any of these trials when also looking over this proverbial flock? Talk to me about a burnout when the shepherd is exhausted and cold and tired.
Absolutely. Well, I actually would say that part of the challenge for helping professionals is this idea that we should be the shepherd. And it's not just our idea, it's, society's idea. The idea that if I'm supposed to be the expert in navigating, for instance, a pandemic, which I've never lived through before, well, I'm not going to be a good enough expert.
Yeah.
Because, I don't know. And so if we see ourselves as a shepherd or a guide, it's a setup. It's a setup to feel like a failure and to get burnt out. On the other hand, if we, instead of seeing ourselves as the expert, we see ourselves as a humble student of life, that we're here to learn from whatever life experiences come our way, then we can be more of a companion on the journey for each person, so that we are looking with curiosity, not from, for instance, like if you've ever been listening to a client and they're sharing something and maybe you're going through that too, and internally you're like, well, I don't know, it's like, what am I supposed to do with that? And, but if well, I don't need to know. Let's be curious about that. Let's look together. I'm with you in this. And that's a much easier stance to take. It's less draining than this like
expert position.
Yeah, expert position, or like I have to be the leader here.
I appreciate you in that finessing of that concept. of this idea of like, is part of just the construct what makes it so burdensome that we are supposed to have all of the answers, that we are supposed to be perfect. We're supposed to not get divorced, not have fights. We're supposed to be perfect parents. We absolutely are not the person behaving poorly in the Target checkout line. That we put this pressure on ourselves to be these like perfect example human beings.
Absolutely. I think it's really comes with burnout. That trying to hold oneself to this impossible standard that really is a pretense. If you look to the roots of psychotherapy, with this sort of Freudian idea that we should be a blank slate. Well, no one's a blank slate, right? Like even a newborn baby, we know carries intergenerational patterns from the start, and is affected by everything that happened before in the womb, right? And so how do we become a blank slate? We have to clear out our own stuff all the time. But we're not meant, and that's important. It's important to show up with presence and availability when we're with a client. But we don't need to be perfect human beings. We're just human beings that are deep listeners, that can give our attention to another person, and are highly trained in all sorts of modalities that can really help somebody to release and to heal. So that's separate, and I think by trying to live up to this image, we create this power imbalance, and it's false. Anyone in the field knows it's false. And I think there needs to be more awareness about that. Our therapists, I think, in modern society, in some ways, have replaced, I don't know, the priests of long ago, in a more religious society. We're supposed to somehow be above it all, but we're not above it all. And I think that, when we can value, how valuable is that to have someone who's able to give their full attention to you, to listen deeply, and then to, offer ways of working with it that are going to be helpful. I mean, you don't get that in regular life. Everybody's going through so much themselves. Yeah. It's enough what we do. We don't also have to be or pretend to be somebody who has it all together all the time.
How do you balance that concept of the therapist being authentic in the room when also being human? And so I'm thinking of conversations, I've certainly had conversations where a client says something that is wounding to me, that has a belief system that knocks the wind out of me. And I go into fight, flight, freeze, any other F you want to add in there, because it's something that is activating for me. How do we balance this idea of being there with the kind of caveat of blank slate that we're actually humans as well?
Yeah, I think of it as, remember that your first job is to regulate your own nervous system. So much of what we need to be doing, it's not about like, let me make sure everything in my life is okay and now I can be a therapist. It's more the regular, everyday practice of clearing, other people's stories and feelings and things like that out of our field, but also regulating our own nervous system. So really developing our own personal easy pathways from that fight or flight response into our ventral vagal nervous system, where we feel calm and centered and can access creative thought. And so then we can respond to the client in a multitude of different ways. But if we are stuck in that sympathetic nervous system arousal, now we've just entered there together, and there's not, we can't even think straight. We're stuck in our own stuff. And so I think the work, rather than focusing on what should I say to this person or what do I do, is that self-awareness, like, ooh, I feel
It's
triggered.
happening. Yeah.
Yes, it's happening right now. Let me take a deep breath. Let me feel my feet on the ground. What do I need to do so that I can get back into a place where I can just listen and, access my intuition or my integration of the different tools I've learned to see what is needed here and now with this person.
You mentioned the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Can you speak a little bit about that on just for this activation physiology 101 of understanding, like, this is what's happening in our bodies, and we therapists are not immune to this. There isn't any way for us to turn this off, and I would also argue, nor should we, but to accept that this is just part of the human condition and what the body is supposed to do when it's activated.
Yeah, absolutely. I am definitely no expert in this, but I've been geeking out on polyvagal nervous system theory lately. And absolutely, it affects everyone who's in a human body. So the way I think of it as, clients, sometimes may arrive to a session and they're in a good place and they might need to talk about some things, but their nervous system's regulated. But they may also sometimes arrive and they're in this sympathetic arousal, the fight or flight, the anxiety, that sort of thing. Or maybe they're, in that more reptilian brain, dorsal nervous system that's just like checking out, deep depression sometimes. It just might look like, not moving forward in any way. And it's really important so we also, therapists, of course, have nervous systems, and this happens to us too. The work is to learn how to get yourself back into the ventral vagal nervous system, which is is that place where we're playful and creative because we're calm and we're centered. And they've even shown that, what we hear and see is different when we're in these different nervous system states. So we have access to more possibilities of how we might respond to a situation when we're in that ventral vagal. So if you think about mirror neurons, we know that we affect each other, right? So if you are in fight or flight and you're the client and I'm a therapist and I start out in my ventral vagal, that's really going to be helpful. We know how that feels to be around someone who's regulated. But if we're both in that arousal or I'm just checked out, it's very challenging. There's nothing there, to pull us back into that ventral vagal. So I just think it's, this is just one way of understanding what's going on in the room. But I find it really helpful to think of, and I see this for a mom too, that your first job is to be the regulated nervous system in the room. So if I'm okay, I'm going to be able to respond and I'm going to be able to see things and hear things that I need to know in order to respond. But if I'm activated myself, we get tunnel vision and we just don't have as much to access.
With that concept in mind, knowing that even before the last few years, but particularly in the last few years, there have been so many challenges in our personal lives and our professional lives. We're not in a perfect world. So there's this perfect world where we would be centered and we would have meditated for 25 minutes this morning and we would have eaten a balanced breakfast and our mornings would have gone well. And that may or may not have happened. When we know that we're already activated, what do we do?
That's such a good question. I'm glad that you presented it in that way, because I am just feel so strongly about that you don't need to have the perfect routine in order to get there. You don't need to meditate for hours every day and, have just these long extended times for all of your self-care practices. Those things are good and they're important. And I think, for one thing, I just want to say to everyone, it's okay to be high maintenance in that area, because we need it, because we actually have to be in a good place for our jobs. So for one thing, if you can make that work in your life, I say go for it. And, if other people have to stretch to make that happen, that's okay too. But on the other hand, there are so many simple tools out there that we can use to shift in the moment. This isn't about controlling the external world and making sure everything's okay out here. Okay, now I can go and do this work, right? It's like, okay, we have the tools. In some ways, we almost have too many tools that it gets so confusing that people think they need to learn more of them. And it's really more about practicing the ones that are simple and easy to integrate. So for instance, breath work. Most therapists I know have been trained at least a little bit in some different kinds of breath work, some easy breaths to do, right? So that's one way, right before a session starts, right? Or in between sessions. I like to go to the bathroom, get a drink of water. When you bring intention, for instance, to, say, washing your hands, so that you are actually, asking the water to cleanse, and I'm letting go of what just happened so that I can be present for the next person. And so we bring that power of our intention into these simple tasks. And that is, the nervous system regulation. It's not about these big ideas. It's really these simple, it's what's happening each moment by moment. So it doesn't have to be so complicated all the time. I think it's really important to keep it simple.
What about when we know we're burned out? And I'm just imagining so many folks listening right now, like nodding.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Because
Yes.
even in the best of times, we're all going to have things in our lives that burn us out. And we also may have client situations that burn us out. And
Yes.
in a perfect world, I would be able to take a couple of months in Aruba and
Yes.
be able to restore. In the absence of that, what do we do?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it's not easy, right? Because there are systemic issues that affect all of us. And I just want to say that up front, because we are trying to be healthy in an unhealthy world. And so there's that. But I think that it's important to take notice when you're feeling that burnt out, when you're like dreading starting your day, or you're, yay, somebody canceled, right? That is a clear sign that you need a break, and maybe you can't take those few months off, but maybe you can take 2 days, and maybe you need some space so that you can start considering what might need to change. And there's both the internal and the external, right? Like, what need to change in my, the way I'm showing up and my attitude, and these things that we've been talking about, sort of how do I do my day, but also bigger lifestyle changes. Do I need to cut back a little? And could I make some changes in my financial life to make that possible? Do I need some unfocused time? I think that that's a big part of burnout, is our work involves very strong attention and focus. Like we're really there and staying focused. And especially for those who have either high caseloads, seeing a lot of clients in a row or doing a lot of, intense trauma work, there has to be balance with the, lying on the ground and staring up at the sky, watching the clouds, unfocused time where nobody's needing anything from us, or we don't need to focus on anything. It's that soft awareness is really replenishing and harder to get to now than it used to be because of modern distractions of technology and phones and all that. But I think it's really important to know when you're feeling that burnt out, something needs to shift here. And oftentimes it has to start with lowering some standards around, I don't know what those are for each person listening to this, but it's like we have to think outside the box. What can I do less of? Do I need to make a change in my schedule? Where can I get some space in my life? And we get into habits, and it can lead to quite, sort of like this martyrdom.
Yeah.
Who wants to be in that? That's not healthy for us or anyone else.
I've heard from more than one clinician in my day, this idea that taking time off is unethical. We cannot have a client that needs to be seen and then not be there. And then this idea that this word of unethical is like this sword that just takes us out at the knees. Can you speak to that idea? Because I think what you're actually saying is the antithesis of that.
Yes.
But to speak to that, because I think for some people, I think we need to hear that of like, this is okay. And in fact, this is an ethical mandate for us to take care of ourselves, not the alternative.
Absolutely. I think to be an ethical therapist, we need to be in integrity. We need to be walking our talk. And absolutely to do, if one is feeling resentful of their clients, that is a clear sign that there's some sort of boundary that we're, crossing, in the sense of I am not replenishing myself enough. That time off from caretaking and from listening and that kind of attention and from being in other people's struggles is essential to us having the inner spaciousness to arrive there. So I think, like you're saying, it is a part of being an ethical therapist, because being in integrity and being whole and taking care of ourselves, I think our clients want that for us. And when it comes to, I really feel, it's like, yes, sometimes it's very hard, right? Like sometimes clients are in crisis and we want to show up and keep showing up. And it's coming right at this place where we also really need a break. I think it's really important to remember that a therapist does not replace community in somebody's life. And so if we are the only support in someone's life, we've got to look at how we're working with that person. This is where, for me, like the social work background comes in, is that we have to look at the larger system here. We are not the end all be all, and we shouldn't be. And we don't want to create that kind of dependency, not only because of what that does to us, but ethically, that client has to go and live their life, so we need to help them build a support system and have people that they can connect with, and somebody who can answer the phone when they're, in crisis. We have to help people build that. it really does take a whole village for all of us, so if we find ourselves feeling like, well, I can't take off because that's going to be abandoning my client, we have to look at, how am I helping my client to feel supported in general, not just through me. So yeah, we really need to be mindful, and this is part of ethics as well, of not fostering dependency. We need to be a part of a client's support system. And if they don't have that, part of our work is in helping them build and create that. And that's really important, that people have more than one person that they can go to when they're in crisis and when they need support, because no one person can be that for everyone. And I think that's the pretense that we actually need to let go of, and to, and this is part of, ethical practice. I think so much of, so many helping professionals, it's like the ego is tied to being helpful. And for many of us, we learned that at an early age, for different reasons, right? We all have our own individual stories, but it's quite common for helping professionals to be highly empathic, very sensitive, and to be the person in their family that caretakes everybody else. To be the helpful one, to be the one, let me just make sure everyone else is okay. Like, oh, there's this crisis, there's this stress. I'm going to be, the good kid. I'm going to be the good one that doesn't cause trouble and that is helpful to other people. And so we form an identity around being helpful. And so for what that can look like as an adult is that we get really, our worthiness is tied to the work that we do. And that's dangerous. And that is a part of burnout, because to know that we are worthy just because we exist, just because any human being, any animal, plant, like just we are here. So we belong here, and we don't have to prove that worthiness by whatever it is that we do for other people. When we can get to that place that there's this relief, and then we can just show up for our clients and be like, hey, we're getting to meet in this time and place, and I'm available, and let's see what happens. It's an easier place to be in together, and so much can unfold. And I think it is something that's not often talked about, the ego of helping professionals, because, generally we're a lot of, nice people who don't come off as arrogant in any way, but everybody has an ego. And it's important to give ourselves what we need, so we're not trying to get those worthiness needs met through our clients.
I'm glad you bring up that aspect of it. For me, I think embracing the research about outcomes, embracing the research about feedback-informed treatment and deliberate practice was really a paradigm shift in challenging my own ego, my arrogance, my inflated sense of self-importance, and recognizing that when I was showing up in a room as expert, when I do that, I'm actually more than likely harming the therapeutic relationship. But for me, recognizing with feedback-informed treatment that in fact our outcomes are better as clinicians when we are not in expert position, when we are malleable and flexible and open to feedback and actively seeking it. But I think it's important for all of us to evaluate how our ego shows up and what we do with that. To circle back to your earlier point, are we taking on this idea where we are solidly in shepherd position? We have to save our flock. They will die without us. And that again, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, it's this construct of pressure.
Isn't it funny how, you know, if we're less attached to outcome, that outcomes are
Yeah.
actually better.
Yeah.
You know, and it's this funny irony how important it is that we let go, you know, because if we, I mean, of course we care, you know, and we in many times want for our clients what they want for themselves, but we're not in control here, and you know, often neither are they. So it's really important to, you know, this shadow side of a helping profession, you know, that you touched upon. You know, it's, if we are getting into perfectionism, for instance, you know, um, and we're focusing on, am I doing well enough, like did I do that right, or you know, just trying to, you know, why isn't this person feeling better by now, and what am I doing wrong, you know, that's this, we fall into that arrogance, right? We fall into thinking that it's all about me in some ways. And I think when we actually care for our egos, like when we're gentle and kind with ourselves and be, you know, saying to ourselves, like, oh, sweetheart, like, I know you care and you want this to go well, and I know it's hard, and I'm with you, and let's see what happens. You know, then we can show up and just more in the intention of, let me be of service here. I don't know what that's going to look like today, but let me be of service here. And then the focus becomes on the client and on the process that's happening, as opposed to whatever's happening for the client being some kind of reflection on me and my value.
It's an interesting point that you brought up. You feel pressured. Like you need to come up with a perfect intervention that's going to stop this conflict that's happening between a teenager and a parent. We could easily veer into a conversation about imposter syndrome and this idea of like
Mm-hmm.
the pressure we're putting on ourselves to have all of the answers. But it also, to me, damages the microcosm and macrocosm phenomenon of therapy. That I think part of the beauty that can unfold in a therapy room is the shared humanity between therapist and client.
Absolutely. And I think it doesn't even always need to be something that's verbalized, you know, and, you know, well, I don't know what to do, right? It's more, you know, when in this type of situation you're talking about, you know, I think it's the therapist's job to help a client connect with their own inner wisdom, because they're the ones living their lives, and they're the only ones who are going to be with themselves throughout that entire life. And so if they can't learn to, you know, you don't want them to be relying on your expert guidance. You want them to be learning how to access their own. And so if somebody brings something into the room and you find yourself thinking, oh, I need to find the right, you know, what should I do with this? And, you know, it gets all into this, what should I do? And, you know, maybe this technique would work and that. Taking a pause and again, bringing this curiosity, you know, asking the client, well, let's explore that, and help them tune in. Again, remembering that your first job is to come into your own regulated nervous system, to just, okay, I'm here and I'm just going to be open and I'm going to trust what arises. I always like to think about, you know, that all communication is improvisation. You know, so if you think about improv and how you're just like, you don't know what's coming and you're just going to bounce off one to the next, you know, and so anything we're doing in the session, it's improvisational. And so if we enter it that way with this sort of creative mindset, it feels so much better than that pressure. That pressure, no one does well under pressure like that, not that kind.
I like that comparison of this being improv. And I think that it's because of our own anxiety with the concept of improv that we want to cloak ourselves, wrap ourselves in an evidence based practice, some manual that we're going to grab on page 347 that's going to bippity
Right.
boppity boop magically heal whatever this problem is. But I'm glad that you brought up
Yes.
that concept and this idea of like we need to embrace the improv. Um, because that's where something is actually kind of unfolding.
Absolutely. And it's oftentimes I'll see therapists when they're really struggling with, something like imposter syndrome or feeling, empathic overload or burnout, will start seeking out more trainings. Well, if I just had some better tools and I was better trained, then I'll be able to deal with this. And that, again, looking at this shadow side, when we are being honest with ourselves, sometimes focusing on what we can do to help other people can be a way of avoiding what's painful in ourselves. And so training is wonderful. And I think especially in the first part of becoming a clinician, it's really important, and both for building confidence and for having the tools. And even later on, of course, do trainings because you want to learn, because it's interesting and there's something more you can add. But it's not going to replace you making the time and space to be with your own feelings and to be in your own discomfort and to receive the support you need to look at yourself and what's really going on.
Julia, I know that much of what you've talked about today has come from your own clinical experience. What is the real consequence of disconnection and therapist burnout on therapy? And I think it's important for us to know this as a gentle kind of, or else. This is why we need to take time off. This is why we need to make sure that we are also, again, with this big asterisk called COVID-19, that we are doing our best to connect with other people and to be healed ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, right. So aside from, the burnout in any field, a consequence being that you're going to lose people, that people will eventually, I can't tell you how many times I see therapists like, what else can I do? Can't do this anymore. Aside from people leaving the field, there's not a lot of research on this specifically, but there was a study published in the Depression and Anxiety Journal in 2018 that's pretty interesting. They surveyed both therapists and their clients, and they found that therapist burnout and low job satisfaction actually did have a statistically significant negative impact on clinical outcomes, which they measured through, depression and anxiety inventories of their clients. So there's that. But we can also just look to our own clinical experience, right? Like, what's going to happen to the therapeutic alliance, which we know is this essential piece of good therapy. If like you mentioned, a therapist is showing up just worn out and not wanting to be there, what's going to happen to any alliance, to any relationship, if this person is like worn out from listening, and doesn't have any emotional capacity left. It's clear that that is not only not a good situation for the therapist, but for the client as well. We pick up on things, and I'm sure this with the feedback informed therapy you do, that it's not, we might think that we're putting on a good show, but clients can feel it, when our attention isn't there. And that's not to say, I do think that a therapist can be having a life crisis, like be going through a dark night of the soul, a really hard time in their life, which happens in all lifetimes, right? They can be going through something and they can still have good sessions. It's not that like just because you have stress that you need to take off every time, because how would we ever continue, right? Especially in these
say,
types of
if that
go-go
were the case, then there would be no therapists
forget
left.
it. Yeah, let's just throw in the towel. But part of how that happens, and I think most therapists can relate to this, like when sometimes you're surprised, like, oh, actually that went well, and I actually feel even a little better. It's because we're doing those simple practices that are in the moment, that I'm able, even though the world is falling apart around me, I am able to feel my feet on the ground. I'm able to breathe and remember I'm okay in this moment. And I can give this time and attention to this one client for this 1 hour. And I'm just going to take it one by one, rather than the whole overwhelming thing at once.
Our clients are compensating us, or a grant is, or an insurance company is, but we are being compensated. We are, as I joke, being paid the big bucks to provide this service. And then we get into this interesting category as the healer is healed. Can you speak to that aspect a little bit?
You mean being healed, like being healed by the work that we're doing with other people?
By us acknowledging that this fills up our cups too. Because I've certainly heard this, and I imagine many therapists have heard this before, where a client says, "You're only here because I pay you."
Yeah. I think, again, on the one hand, there's the fact that we're doing healing work in, I love this. There's a writer and teacher called Mark Silver, and he says that we're in late stage capitalism. And it reminds me of doing hospice work. And it's just like we're in the fall of a system that is really broken and dysfunctional. And so there's that, right? And on the other hand, there is reciprocity in the relationship because of that, the money being paid. The way I like to see it is I am supporting my clients and they are supporting me. We are doing that in a different way. That financial support is what feeds my children, and I am offering emotional support in whatever they're going through, or spiritual support, however you want to understand it. So are we allowed to be affected by our work, to enjoy our work, to feel inspired by our work? I think it's not that it's not right or wrong. It is, right? It's more of an acknowledgement that healing happens through us. And we're playing different roles today. Like I'm in the role of helper and you're in the role of helped, but we're all people and we're going through this together. And I think part of the trouble is that therapy is such a individualistic model, which is why I really like to balance individual work with group and community work, because to remember that we are, like the pinky finger on the hand, we are just a pinky finger, but we're actually part of this much larger organism. And especially when it comes to these collective traumas that you're mentioning, these environmental disasters or mass shootings, these sorts of things. This is community grief work. And yes, we are healed by recognizing that we're not alone in it. And that is good and well. for that, to be in that. Another way to look at it around the money, right? So it's like, okay, well, I'm in the role of helper and my client's in the role of helped, but I'm actually also being helped. I'm actually also healing through this interaction. Well, you can also look at it with the money, right? The client is paying this money, or like you said, maybe in private practice, right? If the client's paying the money, what if it's also helpful to them to actually invest in themselves and say, like, this is worth it. I am actually going to pay money and put in that time to receive. That's powerful, and when it comes to, grant funding or insurance companies, like, yay, let's have the collective support the healing work of the people. That is healthy for a society. It's the system that is sick.
You mentioned kind of seeing a therapist as a pinky finger, but I think that refocus is helpful because then we appreciate ourselves as part of a larger system. Number one, giving us ability to maybe to access that larger system or encourage our clients to access that larger system, but also to be able to acknowledge the drawbacks of that larger system and then to be navigating it together with a client. What are your final thoughts that you want to give to listeners just to conceptualize their role in the healing professional, their own humanity, and how to access that integrity that you've spoken about and embrace our shadow sides as just part of the normal human condition?
Yeah, well, a couple of things I guess I'd say to the helping professionals is it's really important to have spaces in your life where you can be a vulnerable human being amongst other vulnerable human beings. So where you can be in community and just be a person and not be the leader, not be in charge, not have to have it together, and to actually be witnessed in that. And that can be very hard for people who are willing to be, who are in caregiving roles and are used to always being on the helper side of that equation. And it's therapy, and it's all sorts of things. Like, it doesn't have to only be therapy, right? There's all sorts of ways that we can be in community and just be a person. So I think that's important to come back into our own humanity, and also know that a support system is more than just people, right? We need the trees, we need fresh air and, flowing rivers, and to just get back on the earth. And I mean, even the science is showing this now, forest bathing, or look at the science on earthing and grounding. It's like we need to get back into our bodies and be in nature, and just remember, like, we're only here for so long, all of us, some of us longer than others. So all of what we do is important, and we're just here. It's like, I'm just breathing and sitting and talking right now, and the mind has lots more to say about that. But when I can come back and just be in this moment, that's where the source of replenishment is. So I guess I just want, people to leave this conversation knowing that they're not alone in how they're feeling, and that it really is okay to, make the changes slowly, slowly in very small steps that are necessary, so that you can feel well about what you're doing. we're not meant to just be human garbage cans here, just collecting, all of the pain and suffering of the world. We have to go compost that. We have to release it. And I, honor anyone who is working through that process in their own way.
I think that was my favorite quote of the whole interview is we're not meant to be human garbage cans. As a really quick recap, I'm imagining that if you had this magical prescription pad for the healers listening in to replenish, to compost, on that would be perhaps therapy, if that's a service that is helpful for you to be vulnerable. Reconnect with the earth, like be part of nature. I kind of view it as checking our cognition for a little bit, being back in our bodies, not being all up in our frontal lobe, but trying to just experience again. So this element of mindfulness, integration of nature, and connecting back into the earth at large, that we're not just human beings, we're animals as well. What would the other mandates be? What would be on your prescription pad where you could say, these are the things that you need to do to replenish, ideally?
Well, one way I think of therapy is a very receptive work, right? We're showing up and then we're receiving and we're responding. So the balance is to have places for expression. So, and expression can take all sorts of forms depending on what you enjoy, right? So expression could look like writing or singing or art or something that, or movement, something that is letting it out as opposed to just taking it in. So I think that is a huge part of being well in doing this work, is just remembering that we need balance ourselves. And so, going back to what I said before about we need to be high maintenance around this type of self-care and expression, right? Because it's an occupational hazard of the job, the weight that we can feel, the emotional weight and the burnout. And so because that comes with the job, we need more, let's say, alone time, quiet, unfocused time, or expressive modalities that we do. We need more humor in our lives, right? We need more lightness. We have to balance this, like the yin yang. We have to find our own inner balance to be whole, because we are sitting with a lot of suffering. And so it's important for us not to forget the beauty in life also. And I think, in terms of prescription, it is so individual, because each person, what's going to fill your cup might be different than what's going to fill mine. And so it's really about getting honest with yourself and saying, this isn't working, and what do I truly need? And then trusting. And I do think, as any therapist knows, it's like small changes, one at a time, step by step. What's the very next small step that would help me feel more whole?
And as you said that, I suddenly heard the song "Do the Next Right Thing" in my head from Frozen 2. For any folks who are young children or have young children yourselves, you know what I'm talking about. Julia, thank you for spending this time with us. I really appreciate it. I'm going to absolutely be spending my own time kind of marinating in what you've shared today. And I hope that it's also been beneficial for our listeners. For folks who want to learn more about you and about your work, can you share how to do that, please?
Absolutely. Yeah, everything's on my website, which is just my name.com. And you can check out my blog or sign up for my mailing list. I do not bombard people with emails. I try to just write when there's something to say. You can check out the Release and Empower Women Circle and see if that's something you've been craving. You need some support around expression, around releasing, then check that out. And there's a really affordable little practice book called When You're Having a Hard Time, the Little Book That Listens, for anyone who just, needs a practice to get started with. And yeah, I'm open to connection. So just go to the website and check out what's
Wonderful.
there.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing this space. Healer to healer, healing to healing. I appreciate you spending this time with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth, for having me.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.